My son-in-law grabbed the remote out of my hand without looking at me. Just reached across the way you grab something off a shelf, like I wasn't sitting right there holding it. Didn't say, excuse me, didn't say anything. Just took it and changed the channel. From the game I'd been watching for 20 minutes, the game I'd driven 45 minutes to their house specifically to watch, and went back to his phone like nothing had happened. My daughter was in the kitchen. She didn't see it. Or maybe she did and decided not to. I sat there for a second. 63 years old, 2 combat tours in the Gulf, 31 years, running the largest civilian emergency response coordination unit in the state of Georgia. The man who'd put out a refinery fire in 1987 that 3 other agencies had already walked away from, and I reached down and picked up my coffee cup and took a slow sip and said nothing. If you've ever been treated like furniture in a room you helped build, stay with me. This one's for you. I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And if this story hits close to home, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You're going to want to be here for what comes next. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I know. And what I know is that the people who discount you most confidently are usually the ones who'd be most lost without you. I didn't know that was about to be proven in a way I couldn't have written if I tried. My daughter had married Kellerton 3 years earlier. She'd brought him home for the holidays the year before that, and I remember thinking he had the handshake of a man who believed the handshake was the whole interview. Firm, practiced, over fast. He'd looked me in the eye for exactly as long as felt strategic, and then moved on to the food and the football, like he'd already gotten what he needed from me. He was 37. He worked in commercial real estate, and he wore clothes that looked expensive in a way that said he wanted you to notice. My daughter was 34. She had her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and she loved him in that particular way, where you can see a person has decided and you understand the decision is final, and the most loving thing you can do is find the good in it. I found the good. Kellerton was not without it. He was sharp. He could talk to anyone for 20 minutes and leave them feeling like they'd been genuinely seen, which is a real skill, and I don't discount it. He worked hard. He provided. He had, from what I could see, genuine affection for my daughter. What he did not have was any framework for understanding who I was. And because he had no framework, he filled the space with his own assumption, which was that I was a retired old man who drove a truck that was too old and had opinions about things that didn't matter and watched sports with the devotion of someone who had nothing better to do. He wasn't cruel about it. That's the thing people don't understand about this kind of diminishment. It doesn't need cruelty. It just needs consistent, effortless inattention. The remote was the 3rd time in as many visits. Before that, it was a dinner conversation about emergency infrastructure where he'd talked over me twice and then summarized my point back to the table as if he just thought of it. Before that, it was a comment he'd made to my daughter in front of me about how nice it was that I had my routines. My daughter noticed more than she let on. I knew because she'd refill my coffee before I asked, and she'd steer the conversation toward me when she caught it drifting, and she'd squeeze my arm when we said goodbye a beat longer than necessary. She was doing what good people do when they love someone being treated poorly by someone else they love. She was holding both things and hoping they'd stop rubbing against each other. I didn't make it harder for her. That was my choice. I drove home from that visit, the game I'd wanted to watch having ended while I sat in their living room, pretending I hadn't noticed the remote situation, and I let the highway do what it does. I put 60 miles behind me, and I let the thing settle. I was not angry. I want to be precise about that. What I was tired of being unknown by someone who had decided he already knew. 3 weeks later, my son-in-law called me. He had never called me before, texted once about football odds, which I hadn't responded to. But he called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in my workshop finishing a repair on a neighbor's tractor, and he called from his cell, and when I picked up, his voice was different. Not the managed, social voice I knew. The other kind. He said, "I need your help. I don't know who else to call." I set down the wrench. What he'd gotten into was the kind of trouble that starts with one bad decision made fast and metastasizes slow. He'd co-signed a commercial lease for a business partner 18 months ago. Partnership that was going well, then wasn't, then ended badly, and the partner, a man named Dex, who my son-in-law had known since college and trusted accordingly, had stopped paying. Not stopped recently, stopped 9 months ago. Kellerton had found out 3 weeks before he called me. Found out because he'd gotten a notice from the property management company that they were moving toward legal action for the full outstanding balance, which was $219,000. The original lease had run through a building Kellerton's firm managed, which meant his own company was now adjacent to a liability that could, if it came out wrong, end his career. He'd hired an attorney. The attorney had sent letters. Dex had, through his own attorney, responded with a counterclaim that had no merit but had enough complexity to guarantee expensive litigation. And the property management company, which was ultimately controlled by a holding group out of Charlotte, had a legal team that did not negotiate small. My son-in-law had not told my daughter. He was 4 weeks in, and he had not told her. He told me this, and then he was quiet on the line, and I could hear him in that silence in a way I never had in 3 years of knowing him. I said, "How much does your attorney know about the holding company structure?" A pause. "What do you mean?" I said, "The Charlotte Group. Do you know who actually controls the building?" He said, "It's some investment group, Meridian something." I said, "I know Meridian Coast Partners. I know the man who built it. We go back further than you've been alive." Another pause, longer. "You know them," he said. I said, "Let me make some calls. Here is something about me that my son-in-law didn't know, that most people don't know, and that I had never offered because I have learned that offering it sounds like bragging, and I was raised in a house where bragging was the loudest form of insecurity. For 22 years before I retired, I ran emergency coordination for 4 counties in central Georgia. Before that, I was military. Before that, I was the son of a man who built things with his hands and believed that a handshake should mean something, and that the only honest currency is the kind you earn. I had spent 30 years in rooms with people who make decisions about large things, fires, floods, industrial disasters, the meetings that happen before the news cameras arrive and after they leave. I had shaken hands with senators and insurance executives and EPA directors and the general counsel of companies whose names you see on buildings. Not because I sought those rooms, but because the work put me in them repeatedly and I had conducted myself there in a way that left a mark. I had met Warren Tidewell at a FEMA roundtable in 2009. He was 42 then, building what would become Meridian. We'd sat next to each other at a dinner because of alphabetical seating and discovered we'd both been through the same hurricane response in '04 from different sides of the coordination table. We'd stayed in contact. He'd sent me a bottle of bourbon when I retired. I had his personal cell number in my phone. I called him on Wednesday morning. Warren picked up on the second ring. We talked for 6 minutes about nothing important first, because that's how it's done with people you actually know. Then I told him I had a situation that involved a property his company held in Atlanta, and I wanted to understand it before I decided what I thought about it. He said, "Send me the address and I'll have someone call you by end of day." The someone who called me was the VP of Legal Operations. She had the address pulled up before she said hello. She walked me through the account status, the outstanding balance, the timeline of default. She was professional and thorough, and she was clearly trying to assess what I was and what I wanted. I said, "I'm not trying to make a problem go away. I'm trying to understand whether there's a version of this that's equitable and doesn't require 3 years of litigation to arrive at." She said, "What do you know about the guarantor's situation?" I said, "Enough to know that the default was driven by a partner walkout, that he didn't see coming, and that he's been trying to resolve it without the tools he needs." I said, "I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness of a debt. I'm calling to ask whether there's a structured resolution that serves your company's interest better than a judgment that may take 2 years to collect against a man who's going to fight it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What kind of structure are you thinking?" I said, "I don't know your constraints well enough to say yet, but if you can tell me what outcome your company actually needs from this, I might be able to help find a path there that doesn't cost everyone 3 years." She said she'd call me back. She called back the next morning. What she told me was that Meridian's primary interest was not in the litigation. Litigation was a tool, not a preference. What they needed was a credible resolution plan because the outstanding balance was material enough to sit on their books in a way that affected their own reporting. A structured repayment agreement, properly collateralized, was actually more valuable to them than a protracted judgment process. I said, "How much flexibility is there on timeline if the collateral is solid?" She gave me a range. I said, "Let me come back to you in a week." I did not call my son-in-law yet. I wanted to understand the full picture first. I called my own attorney, a man I've known since we were in the Army together, and who has spent the last 30 years doing things in Georgia real estate that you only do when you actually understand how the system works. I laid out the situation. He walked me through what Kellerton's exposure actually was versus what the counterclaim from Dex could realistically accomplish. The picture was not as bad as my son-in-law's attorney had apparently framed it. That's the thing about fear. It makes lawyers sound like prophets of doom because that's when their clients need them most, and clients in fear often hear the worst version. The actual situation had a shape. Shapes can be worked with. A week after the call from Warren's VP, I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee and worked through what I knew. Then I called my son-in-law. I said, "I need you to come out here, not with my daughter, just you." He was there on Saturday morning. He drove 2 hours, and he showed up in clothes that were too deliberate for a Saturday in the country, and he stood in my kitchen looking like a man who had been scared for a month and was doing everything he could to look like he hadn't. I poured him coffee. I sat down across from him. I said, "Tell me everything from the beginning. Don't summarize. Just tell it." He told it. It took 40 minutes. He was thorough, more thorough than I expected. The fear had burned away the performance, and what was underneath was actually a capable mind doing its best, with a situation that had outpaced it. When he finished, I said, "You need to jaw tightened." "I know." I said, "Not because she can fix it, but because she's going to find out, and there's a version where she finds out you kept it from her, and a version where you told her yourself. You need to be in the second version." He was quiet. I said, "I've made some calls." He looked up. I said, "I know the principals at Meridian. I've spoken to their legal team. There's a structured resolution available that your attorney doesn't know is on the table because your attorney is thinking about litigation and the other side is thinking about their books. Those are different problems and they have different solutions." He stared at me. I watched him recalculate something. I said, "This is what I need from you. I need full financial disclosure, everything, the whole picture. Because the collateral structure has to be real. I need you to fire your current attorney and hire the man I'm going to recommend, who actually knows how this kind of agreement gets papered. And I need you to call Dex's attorney and tell them the counterclaim is going to be withdrawn." He said, "How are you going to make Dex withdraw the counterclaim?" I said, "Dex didn't want litigation. I'm going to remove the leverage." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Why are you doing this?" I didn't answer right away. I refilled my coffee. I set the pot down. I looked at him across the table. I said, "Because she loves you, and because you called me when you needed help, which tells me more about who you are than 3 years of dinners ever did." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know you had these kinds of connections." I said, "You didn't ask." That was as close as I came to saying the thing that was under everything. He heard it. I could see him hear it. It landed in the right place. What happened over the following 6 weeks was not simple, but it had a shape and shapes can be worked. My attorney drew up a repayment structure that gave Meridian solid collateral in the form of Kellerton's equity stake in 2 properties his firm managed that were performing well. The timeline gave him breathing room without giving Meridian anything to complain about. Warren's VP signed off on it within 48 hours of receiving the draft. Dex's counterclaim was a different matter. That required a conversation I'd been putting off and finally made on a Thursday morning, a call to a man who owed me a favor from 2015 when I'd helped redirect a county contract dispute that was going to cost him his license. I called in the favor. He made a call. Dex's attorney called Kellerton's attorney by Friday afternoon and told him the counterclaim was being dropped. My son-in-law called me when he got the news. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I don't know how you did that." I said, "You don't need to know how. You need to know it's done." He told my daughter that same evening. I know because she called me that night. She cried a little. And then she said, "Daddy, what did you do?" I said, "I helped." She said, "He told me you knew people, that you made calls." I said, "I made some calls." She was quiet. Then she said, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I thought about the remote control. I thought about the dinner where he'd summarized my point and handed it back to the table as if it were his. I thought about my routines. I said, "You never ask, sweetheart." She laughed, a small, complicated laugh. Then she said, "He wants to come out next weekend. Both of us. He wants to sit down with you properly." I said, "I'll make sure there's coffee." They came out the following Saturday. My daughter brought a pie. My son-in-law shook my hand at the door, the same handshake as always, but slower. Like he'd decided the handshake was no longer the whole interview and he wasn't sure yet what it was supposed to be instead. We sat on the back porch. It was late October, and the air had that particular quality it gets in Georgia in the fall, cool enough to feel like something, warm enough to stay outside. The game was on inside, but nobody moved to turn it on. That was a first. My son-in-law asked me about my work. Not politely, actually asked. Wanted to know about the refinery fire from '87. Wanted to know how emergency coordination actually worked, the structure of it, what the decisions look like when you're in the middle of something that's bigger than any one person can hold. I told him. Not the headline version, the actual version, the version where you understand that authority in a real crisis isn't about rank or title. It's about who can hold the shape of the problem while everyone else is reacting to its edges. He listened the whole time. He didn't talk over me. He didn't summarize it back. When I finished, he said, "You were running those rooms the way you helped me with this situation." I said, "More or less." He said, "And you never mentioned any of it." I said, "There was never an opening." He held that for a moment. Then he said, "That's my fault." I said, "It's not about fault. It's about knowing who's in the room." My daughter reached over and put her hand on my arm. She left it there. My son-in-law looked out at the yard. The trees were starting to change, and the light was the kind of low, slanted autumn light that makes everything look like it's already a memory. He looked like a man who was revising something he'd carried for a while and wasn't certain yet what the revised version looked like. He said, "I owe you more than this situation. I think I've been." He stopped, found the honest version. "I think I've been looking at you wrong since I walked in the door 3 years ago," he said. "I saw what I expected to see and I didn't look past it." I said, "Most people don't." He said, "I should have. I received that. I didn't perform forgiveness. I didn't say it's fine or don't worry about it. I said, I know you should have and I'm glad we're here now." He nodded once. That was enough. We watched the sun drop through the trees for a while. The pie was good. My daughter had made it from scratch, a fact she mentioned exactly once and didn't need to say again. My son-in-law got up to refill everyone's coffee without being asked, which was a thing I had never seen him do. When they left that evening, he shook my hand again at the door. The same hand, but a different handshake. He looked at me the whole time. He didn't move on to the car before my daughter did. My daughter hugged me for a long time. She said, "I love you, Daddy." I said, "I know you do. I love you too." I watched them drive down the long gravel drive until the taillights disappeared into the dark at the end of the road. Then I went inside and sat in the chair where I watched the games, and I turned on the television, and I held the remote in my own hand, and the game was almost over, and it didn't matter at all. I've spent a long time knowing things that other people didn't know I knew. I've spent a long time being present in rooms where people assumed I was furniture. I never corrected the assumption because I learned a long time ago that correcting it doesn't work. People revise their understanding of you when they need to, when the situation outpaces their expectations, when the version of you they'd been carrying turns out to be insufficient for the moment they're standing in. My son-in-law needed a version of me that the dinners hadn't shown him. The situation provided it. I didn't engineer that. I didn't wait for it. I just kept being who I am, in the room, available, without needing to announce it. Terrence, the man I'd worked beside for 11 years at the coordination unit, told me something once at the end of a very long night, after a flood response that had gone 3 days without sleep. He said, "The ones who hold the room quiet don't usually look like they're holding anything." I've thought about that sentence more than most things said to me in 63 years. My son-in-law calls me now. Not for help mostly, just to talk. He asks questions. He listens. He's different with my daughter when I'm around, more settled, less performing. I don't know if he'd connect it to that Saturday morning in my kitchen or whether it's something he's integrating slowly, the way most real changes happen, quietly and without announcement. I don't need him to know the whole of it. I don't need credit or recognition or a conversation where he tells me what I mean to him. I never needed any of that. I only ever needed to be in the room and to be ready, and when the moment arrived, to do what the moment required. That's all I've ever been. That's all I need to be. And it has always, without exception, been enough.